Exodus chapter 16. Exodus chapter 16. And follow along as I read the first 5 verses, and then we'll drop down to verse 14. Beginning verse 1, Exodus chapter 16. The Bible says, "They took their journey from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the 2nd month after their departing out of the land of Egypt. And the whole congregation of the children of Israel murmured against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said unto them, Would to God we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots, and when we did eat bread to the full. For ye have brought us forth into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Then said the Lord unto Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven, for you and the people shall go out and gather a certain rate every day, that I may prove them whether they will walk in my way, my law, or no. And it shall come to pass that on the 6th day they shall prepare that which they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily." Now drop down to verse 14. "When the dew that lay was gone up, behold, upon the face of the wilderness there lay a small round thing, as small as the hoar frost, on the ground. And when the children of Israel saw it, they said one to another, It is manna, for they wist not what it was. And Moses said unto them, This is the bread which the Lord hath given you to eat. This is the thing which the Lord hath commanded. Gather of it every man according to his eating, an omer for every man, according to the number of your persons. Take ye every man for them which are in his tents. And the children of Israel did so, and gathered some more, some less. And when they did meet it with an omer, he that gathered much had nothing over, and he that gathered little had no lack. They gathered every man according to his eating. And Moses said, Let no man leave of it till the morning. Notwithstanding, they hearkened not unto Moses, but some of them left it until the morning, and it bred worms and stank, and Moses was wroth with them. And they gathered it every morning, every man according to his eating, and when the sun waxed hot, it melted. And it came to pass that on the 6th day they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for one man, and all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. And he said to them, This is that which the Lord has said, Tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake that which ye will bake today, and seethe that ye will seethe, and that which remaineth over lay up for you to be kept until the morning. And they laid it up till the morning, as Moses bade, and it did not stink, neither was there any worm therein. And Moses said, Eat that today, for today is a Sabbath unto the Lord. Today ye shall not find it in the field. 6 days ye shall gather it, but on the 7th day, which is the Sabbath, in it there shall be none. And it came to pass that there went out some of the people on the 7th day to gather, and they found none. And the Lord said to Moses, How long refuse ye to keep my commandments and my laws? See, for that the Lord hath given you the Sabbath, therefore he giveth you on the 6th day the bread of 2 days. Abide ye every man in his place, let no man go out of his place on the 7th day. So the people rested on the 7th day. And the house of Israel called the name thereof manna, and it was like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. And Moses said, This is the thing which the Lord commandeth. Fill an omer of it to be kept for your generations, that they may see the bread wherewith I have fed you in the wilderness, when I brought you from the land of Egypt. And Moses said unto Aaron, Take a pot, and put an omer full of manna therein, and lay it up before the Lord, to be kept for your generations, as the Lord commanded Moses. So Aaron laid it up before the testimony to be kept. And the children of Israel did eat manna 40 years, until they came to a land inhabited. They did eat manna until they came unto the borders of the land of Canaan. And omer is the 10th part of an ephah. Here we read of the children of Israel wandering in the wilderness, having left Egyptian bondage, and the provision that God had made for them to eat. And before that provision had been taken care of, the Bible tells us that the children of Israel murmured against God, the one who had saved them from their captivity, the one who had already blessed them with their freedom, the one who had began their journey, if you will, to give them the promised land that he had promised unto their forefathers. But because of their disobedience, they would wander in the wilderness for 40 years, and those that were under 20 years of age would be able to enter into the promised land, but those over 20 would die in the wilderness. But for 40 years, the children of Israel had been waiting, or were going to wait in the wilderness, and they were going to wander in the wilderness. And before they could even get started, they began their murmuring against God and against his ministers, against his leaders, Moses and Aaron. And God still made provision for them. It was always God's divine intention to make sure that they were well taken care of in the wilderness. The promised land was a land that flowed with milk and honey. They didn't get that. They weren't going to have the beautiful fields and the watering spots that perhaps they would have gotten if they had gone on into Canaan. And so God was going to make sure that while they were in a desert land or in a wild land, that they would be taken care of. And so we're going to look at this thing called manna. And the sermon is entitled, "What is it?" Because that's what the people of Israel said when they saw it. What is this? They didn't know what it was. And therefore the word manna, in essence, means what is it? They didn't know exactly what it was. They'd never seen it before. And so Moses tells them, this is the bread which you asked for. This is the bread which is going to take care of you throughout your generations. And in Numbers chapter 11, I believe, Numbers 11. Verse 8, the Bible tells us that the people went about and gathered it and ground it in meals or beat it in a mortar and baked it in pans and made cakes of it. And the taste of it was the taste of fresh oil. In this particular text in Exodus 16, the Bible tells us that it was sweet to taste. Exodus 16 verse 31, it was like wafers made with honey. So it was a bread that was tasty, and it could have been eaten alone, or as Numbers 11 verse 8 tells us, it had a wide variety of uses, didn't it? So this was a bread which they didn't know about, they had never seen before, and they said, what is it? Well, what is it? Well, the first thing is that Moses tells them, this is the bread which you asked for. This is the bread which you're going to be eating while we're in the wilderness for 40 years. You're going to eat it while we're wandering in the wilderness until we get to Canaan. And it is a wafer, a taste of honey. It has a wide variety of uses. That was good because God knew these people would probably murmur again, this is a very boring food, so he gave them something that they could turn into cakes or make flour of or whatever they wanted to do. But it came with certain conditions, didn't it? As we just read. They were to gather just enough, an omer for each person for each day. Except on the sixth day, they were to gather enough for the sixth and the seventh day, because on the Sabbath day they were to rest. And on the seventh day, the Lord didn't present any manna. That was his day of rest too. And but the people tested the Lord even on that day, going out to see if there was any more, and there wasn't. They were told how to take care of it, how to provide for it. It was to be eaten in that day. It was to be eaten in that day and not kept unto the morning. And the Bible says there were some who tried to keep it into the morning, and in the morning they woke up and it was full of worms and it stank and it was worthless. And so when God gave them this provision, it was a provision that was reliant upon their faith that God would provide for them as he said he would. He said, I will provide you this bread, this manna, every day for 6 days. And on the sixth day you can gather twice as much and it won't stink on the seventh day. But if you wait until the morning, it's going to stink. It's going to be worthless. So they had to rely upon God. They had to rely upon God every day. And so those who didn't have the faith, who said, well, I'm going to make sure I get mine today for tomorrow because tomorrow it may not come, found out that the extra that they gathered did them no good. They didn't have the faith in God, did they? That they needed to know that if God said He's going to provide it every morning, that He would provide it every morning. In verse 14, the Bible tells us that what it was something that was really small. When the dew that lay was gone up, behold, upon the face of the wilderness there lay a small round thing, as small as the hoarfrost on the ground. It was very small. You know, some of the people probably looked at it and said, how are we going to take care of ourselves with this? This is too small, right? But you know, God doesn't need large and impressive things to take care of His people. And the people needed to learn that they didn't need large and impressive things, that they could rely upon God. And if God said this is what you need, then they needed to have the faith and the love towards God in understanding that this small thing is the blessing that we need, right? The Bible tells us that it was round. It was natural looking. In other words, they might have not known what it was, but it wasn't a shape that they had never seen before. It didn't look like something that would scare them off, right? It was round. It was simple in shape. It was logical in shape. The Bible tells us that the earth was curved, the roundness of the earth. Lots of things the people could just see with their eye. The moon is round, right? Different things that they could just witness that were logical and reasonable shapes. It was round. Verse 31 tells us the color of this bread. It was like coriander seed, white. Some say that this white was more of a gray, silverish tone, the color of coriander seed. But whether it was white or silvery or grayish or one of those tones, right? There could be different tones, I suppose, of the color. It was a familiar color to them. It was a familiar tone of color. It was a comfortable color. It was something that to them would represent something that was clean, right? Something that we understand white today to being purity. But to them, this color would have been a clean looking color. It wouldn't have looked dirty, or it wouldn't have looked unhealthy to them. But at the same time, it was kind of bland, wasn't it? I mean, it wasn't shiny, it wasn't sparkly, it wasn't glittery. And a lot of times God's people tend to want to go out and ask God for something. And not only do they want it to be large and impressive, they want it to be shiny and they want it to stick out, right? But this particular provision of God was very simple. It was small, it was round, it was a generic color, if you will, a general color. All comforting to the people on one hand, but on the other hand, somewhat under-impressive, if you will, to them at the same time. The Bible also tells us that this came at night. Verses 13 and verse 14. They were to wait for it, right? They were to wait for it. This was to come at night. We don't necessarily have to see God's provisions given to us to know that they exist when they're there, right? You know, a lot of people could have been wondering, they could have been staying up all night long wondering, when is this thing going to get here? Once again, a lack of faith, right? Because God said in the morning when you get up, you go out, it'll be there. And there was no need to lose sleep, in other words. There was no need to lose rest. God didn't need to put on a show, in other words. Now, there are people today that want God to put on a show. They want God to put on a show. They want a miracle every day. They want something special and supernatural. And perhaps they want that because they want to confirm their faith in God, but they're looking for a confirmation of their faith in the wrong place. The confirmation of faith comes from understanding the truth and the historical Jesus. that he already performed these miracles, that there were eyewitnesses to these events, and that they've been written down for us to understand and know. And so we don't have to see the shiny thing, do we? We know that they took place. God did this at night when nobody saw it. Right? Nobody saw it. But today, people want to see something grand and miraculous, supernatural. And God doesn't need that. God doesn't need that approval from us. He doesn't have to He's already done what He's done. And when we wake up in the morning and we see what we see, that should be evidence enough that God exists, but it's not to a lot of people. But the folks woke up every morning and there was the manna, just as God had said, which proved that the night before God did something miraculous, right? God did something. That's why it's so sad that people can wake up every morning today and they can see nature around them, they can see the sun, they can talk about the eclipse and how intriguing that is, and think that that's all accidental. That's all accidental. It's foolish. God shows us more than really we need to see to prove He is. But this was given at night. He didn't need to show off for the people, did He? He gave them what they needed. They didn't see it happen. It just happened. We'll let everybody's warnings go off here.
Must be an Amber Alert.
I know who puts their phone on vibrate and who doesn't now. Mine's on vibrate. I'm bragging, but I'll have to put a sign up here. Please put phones on vibrate. Exit to the left, exit to the right. All right. No, I'm just kidding. Okay. So it was small, it was round, it was of a general color, a generic color, and it came at night. It was also misunderstood, right? They didn't really understand it, and that's understood by us by the fact that they called it manna, right? What is this? My understanding of the word manna is it's, I think, a compound Hebrew word which is transliterated into English manna. But the idea was they didn't know what it was. They didn't know what it was. And so Moses had to translate it for them, right? This is bread. This is bread. So at first they saw what God had done for them. And they remembered that God told them, I will provide you bread, right? That's what He said in Exodus 16. I will provide you bread from heaven, verse 4. I will rain bread from heaven. So even though they had been told, even though they had been expecting it, and even though it showed up, they still didn't understand it. But even though they didn't understand it, God told them what it was, and He didn't have to explain that any further, did He? He didn't have to explain that any further. Why manna, God? You know, we kind of talked about that during our Bible class. Why did you choose manna? Well, I think one of the reasons He chose manna, we can see that it had multiple uses. It was good to taste. I mean, there was a lot of good reasons that He chose manna. But God didn't have to explain Himself, did He? It was misunderstood, but all that was needed to be understood was it's bread, you can eat it, and here's when you can collect it. In verse 17 and verse 18, the Bible tells us that it was sufficient. When God provides something, it's not lacking, is it? Notice He says, the children of Israel did so. They gathered, some more, some less, depending on how many people were in their family. And when they did meet it with an omer, he that gathered much had nothing over. He that gathered little had no lack. They gathered every man according to his need. Every man had what he needed. God took care of everybody. Right? Didn't matter who they were, what tribe they were in, whose family they were in. It didn't matter if you had a big family or a small family. Everybody got what they needed. And some might say, well, that family got more than I did. Well, they had a bigger family. But were you lacking? No, I got everything I needed. You know, that's a big problem in the world today. They've got more than I do. They've got less than I do. Why don't we just take care of self? Why don't we just take care of our needs and take care of our relationship with God? God will take care of our need, but we don't need to judge our need based upon someone else's need. It was sufficient. It was so sufficient that the Bible said this is how the children of Israel were fed for 40 years. Verse 35, the children of Israel did eat manna 40 years. Until they came to a land inhabited, they did eat manna until they came unto the borders of the land of Canaan. That's a very good source of nutrition, isn't it? It was good enough for the young, right? Because at a young age you need certain nutrients. And when you get old, you need certain nutrients, right? When you're young, you sometimes drink from a bottle, and when you get old, sometimes you drink from a bottle, right? The circle of life, if you will. But this manna, it didn't matter how small you were, how big you were, how tall you were, how short you were, how young you were, how old you were. It was good enough for everybody, wasn't it? And it was good enough for 40 years. So if you were young when you started eating it, 40 years later, you're a little bit older, but it was still good enough, wasn't it? God's provisions were sufficient for every need. It didn't matter whether you were young or old. It didn't matter what tribe you were in. It didn't matter if you were small or large. It was sufficient. And you know, the Bible tells us that the gospel of Christ is sufficient for every man. It doesn't matter who you are, where you came from, right? All Scripture, inspired of God, and it's profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for rebuke, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God might be perfect, thoroughly furnished unto all good works. Doesn't matter who you are, how old you are, where you came from, where you live. It's all sufficient. It provides us all our needs, doesn't it? God knows how to provide our needs in a simple, logical, reasonable format. In verse 32, Moses said, "This is the thing which the Lord commands, fill an omer of it to be kept for your generations, that they may see the bread therewith I have fed you in the wilderness, when I brought you forth from the land of Egypt." I guess it was Wednesday night we talked about memorials. Here's a memorial, all right? This bread was not to be kept in a box to be eaten, right? It was to be kept as a memorial. And he tells us why. It's to be kept through your generations, right? Through the generations of Israel, till they come into the land of, when they come into the land of Canaan, that they could look back and they could say, this reminds us of what? You know, that's what the whole purpose of a memorial is, to remind us of something. It might be to remind us of something bad. In this case, it was to remind them of something good and bad, right? What did manna tell the children of Israel who were born decades, generations later? This manna, what is that? You know, they were still asking, what is this manna? But their parents or their grandparents or their great-grandparents or their great-great-grandparents could say, let me tell you what that manna was. It's a memorial for the fact that we weren't faithful enough. We didn't have enough faith to go into the promised land when we could have. And our forefathers had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Now that's a bad memorial, isn't it? But it's also a good memorial in that it said, but through that 40 years, God took care of us every day. That's what the manna said, wasn't it? That's what the manna said. And it was to be kept a memorial, that they may see the bread wherewith I have fed you in the wilderness when I brought you forth from the land of Egypt. So it also reminded them that God saved them from Egypt, that he provided for them in the wilderness. But it was also a memorial that they weren't in the land of Canaan when they could have been. And so in that sense, this manna was kind of passed on to future generations, wasn't it? It was shared with others. In verse 14 and verse 15, and perhaps this is a minute point, and it may not be accurate in all instances, but I think for the most part it makes sense. It says, when the dew that lay was gone up, behold, upon the face of the wilderness there lay a small round thing, as small as the hoarfrost on the ground. And when the children of Israel saw it, they said one to another, it is manna, for they wist not what it was. And Moses said unto them, this is the bread which the Lord hath given you to eat. And then following, this is the thing which the Lord hath commanded. Gather of it every man according to his eating. Now how did they gather this? It was small. It was lying on the ground. My guess would be that they had to bend over, get down on a knee, bow down, if you will, and pick it up. Right? I mean, that would be my guess, is that they would have to get down, prostrate themselves, right? Prostrate themselves on the ground to pick this up. And I wonder if that idea of bowing down was a way in which they could show submission to God, that this is what I have provided for you, but your response to my provision is that you need to humble yourself before me. Not only that, they had to gather it themselves. Verse 16, gather of it every man. You know, there's a lot of people that would say, well, God should have just put it in a pot and handed it to me, and that way I didn't have to work for it. God expected these people to work for it, didn't he? It was free. Every day they could go out and get free food, but they had to go work for it. They had to go get down on their knee and pick it up. And it wouldn't shock me if there be people today too lazy to go out and get on a knee and pick it up. They'd starve to death because they're too lazy to go out and pick it up off the ground. It's sitting there waiting on them. But that's the way this manna was. It was there for the taking, if the people would simply do what God said to do and go get it. For nearly 13,000 days, the people of Israel picked up manna, and they ate it in one form or another. God expects us to accept his provisions, but he expects us also to put a little effort into it, doesn't he? He expects us to appreciate those provisions, and he expects us to gather when we're called to gather. He expects us to participate, if you will, share in the load. You know, God did his part. Now he expected man to do his part. I've given you the manna, go get it. It was free. It was good. It was all sufficient. It was everything they needed. But they had to go get it. They had to go gather it. They had to work for it. It was also something that supplied them hope. They were now wandering in the wilderness, and they knew they were going to be there for 40 years. And you could look ahead 40 years and go, this is going to be a long ride. And you could see some folks with sadness in their eyes as they looked ahead for 40 years and said, we'll never make it. Or how depressing that could have been, right? But this bread that came from heaven every day gave them hope, didn't it? Because they knew God takes care of me every day. And if I'm going to be here for 40 years, God's going to take care of me for 40 years. And if God fulfills that promise, what other promise will he fulfill? That at the end of 40 years, we'll go into Canaan. And so if every day I wake up and I see manna, that's another day I know I'm another day closer to Canaan, you see. So this manna gave the people hope. It fulfilled the promise of God to take care of them. And it gave them hope because they knew if he fulfills this promise every day, then on that last day, I'll be entering Canaan, won't I? They had the promise of food tomorrow, and they had the promise of Canaan in the future. They could lie down at night with the assurance that God knew what they needed and he would provide, because every night went by and every morning there was manna, except on that seventh day. So what is it? Well, we've kind of described what it is, right? But go back to Exodus chapter 16 and look at verse 7. Oh, wait a minute. It's verse 6. And Moses and Aaron said unto all the children of Israel, at evening, then ye shall know that the Lord hath brought you out from the land of Egypt. And in the morning, then ye shall see the glory of the Lord. For that he heareth your murmurings against the Lord. And what are we that ye murmur against us? What is this manna? It was the glory of the Lord. This was the grace of God being bestowed upon the people of Israel. Now think of that in correlation with us today. God bestows his grace upon us today just like he bestowed it upon them. Sometimes it might be small, it might be round, it might be grayish, it might be bland. But you know what? It takes care of our needs. It tastes good. It's a blessing from God, right? It may come at night when we don't see it, when we don't expect it. We might not understand it at first, right? When God blesses us, he expects us to share that with others, to pass it down to future generations. In order for us to receive the grace and the blessings of God, he expects us to get on a knee and pick something up, doesn't he? He expects us to gather those grace, those blessings. And those blessings and the grace of God that we receive every day, like those receiving the manna, gives us hope, doesn't it? Our hope is also Canaan. Our Canaan is heaven. And every day we receive the grace of God, and every day we receive the blessings of God, and we appreciate those blessings, and we appropriate that grace through obedience to God's will. We recognize that we're another day closer to our Canaan. There is a day when God's grace ends, when God's blessings end. In Joshua chapter 5, verse 11 and verse 12. After the children of Israel had passed over the Jordan River, they had begun their conquest of Canaan. The Bible says in verse 11, they did eat of the old corn of the land on the morrow after the Passover, unleavened cakes and parched corn in the selfsame day. Now that's a different meal than they had had for 40 years, isn't it? But notice verse 12, and the manna ceased. The manna ceased. On the morrow after they had eaten of the old corn of the land, neither had they children of Israel manna any more, but they did eat of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year. You know, there's a day coming when we'll see no more manna. We'll cross our own Jordan River. And the day of God's grace and the day of God's blessing will be gone. What we did with God's grace and what we did with God's blessing as we wandered in the wilderness before our Jordan crossing is what will determine what we eat tomorrow. Right? In John chapter 6, I'm looking for my verse. I didn't write it down here. Okay, verse 30. They said therefore unto him, What sign showest thou then, that we may see and believe thee? What dost thou work? Our fathers did eat manna in the desert, as it is written, He gave them bread from heaven to eat. Then said Jesus to them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, Moses gave you not that bread from heaven, but my Father giveth you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he which cometh down from heaven and giveth life unto the world. In verse 35, Jesus said, I am the bread of life. He that cometh to me shall never hunger, and he that believeth on me shall never thirst. Jesus is our manna. He is our blessing. He is our bread of life. He sustains us. He provides us all our needs if we'll be faithful to Him. And if we'll be faithful to Him, when we come to the Jordan River and are ready to cross into the next life, we'll be ready. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 24, another memorial that we're about to partake of in just a moment. The Bible says that Jesus gave thanks, He brake the bread, and He said, Take, eat, this is my body, which is broken for you. This do in remembrance of me. The same manner also He took the cup when He had supped, saying, This cup is the New Testament in my blood. This do ye as oft as you drink of it in remembrance of me. Now notice, for as oft as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you do show the Lord's death till He come. There's a day when we won't need a memorial, because He'll be here. And on that day, there'll be no more grace. There'll be no more blessings. We will have appropriated the grace, and however we have chosen in this life as we wander in the wilderness, we will have either rejected God's blessings or accepted God's blessings. We will have either eaten of the bread of life, listened to His words, listened to His teachings, obeyed Him, or not. And then we'll receive our judgment. If we have been faithful to the Lord, when that manna ceases, on the morrow we'll eat the fruit of Canaan. We'll eat in the land which flows with milk and honey. We'll be in heaven, the paradise of God, where every day is a blessing, where every day is grace. So what is it? Well, it's God's grace, isn't it? It's God's blessing. And it's applicable to us today. Today, if you've not appropriated God's grace and accepted that grace in receiving the gospel and obeying the gospel, you have that opportunity. The Bible tells us faith comes by hearing, Romans 10, verse 17. Faith leads us to work obedience, to do acts of obedience like repent of sin. Luke 13, verse 3, confess that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Romans 10, 9 and 10. And to be immersed in water, to have our past sins washed away. God has given us the blessing, the freedom of salvation if we'll bow down and pick it up. Like that manna. Are we willing to accept that grace? Are we willing to appropriate that grace? Are we willing to receive that blessing and to do our part? And if we are, we can put on Christ by being buried with Him in baptism. Romans 6, verse 3 and verse 4. Those obedient souls are added to the Lord's church, Acts 2, verse 47, where we live in anticipation of that last great day. Just like those folks in the wilderness hoped and longed for that last day before they crossed into the promised land. That's what we're here to do today. To serve God, to obey God, to receive His blessings, to accept His grace, to appropriate that grace, and then to look forward to that day when we cross over into the eternal land of Canaan, the heaven of God. If you've not yet obeyed the gospel, the invitation is open. If you've already obeyed those initial steps but have